Hi, it's Chris with Write Better Right Now. Last week I talked about fast starts for novels, and so you can go back and check out that video if you missed it. I want to go into a little more detail on first chapters today. I have written a number of novels over the years, many, many novels. Some of them have even gotten published, and I've learned a lot, and I wish I had learned some things earlier. So the first chapter is so important because it is what hooks the reader, ideally. But it's not enough to just get off to a fast start that grabs the reader. You have to get off to the right kind of fast start for your novel. And my friend Suzanne Morgan Williams, author of Bull Rider and other books, talked about the promise of the first chapter in a workshop that she gave. This is an important concept because sometimes when writers are trying to grab the reader's attention right away, they start with a big action scene, which might work if you have an action novel, but doesn't work if you actually have a quieter lyrical novel about someone coming to terms with grief. So you want your novel to have the right first chapter that fits the book, and you want the rest of your book to fulfill the promises that you make in that first chapter. So that opening chapter has to do a lot. It should establish the genre, especially if it's not a contemporary story, if it's fantasy, science fiction, historical. You want to give clues early on that this is not right now. If it's writing for young people, you want some idea of the reader age range that's appropriate, establish a setting, introduced one or more main characters. Ideally, you get some kind of goal or problem with tension for that main character. You might not be able to introduce the main problem yet, but there should be something happening actively where the main character is trying to solve a problem or reach a goal. You want to establish the structure. Now, if you switch point of view between chapters, then you can't necessarily show that in the first chapter, but you don't want to wait too long to let the reader know that's what you're doing. And if you have any kind of unusual format, like it's a novel in letters or alternating newspaper articles and emails and so forth, you probably want to get that up front. And then you want to establish the tone or the voice. And that can include things like whether it's serious or humorous, whether it is fast paced or more leisurely and lyrical. So you want to have all of those things showing up in your first chapter so that readers know what to expect. Those are your promises. Let's look at an example from Bull Rider. It opens like this. Folks in Salt Lick say I couldn't shake bull riding if I tried. It's in my blood, my family. Around here, any guy named Kamamara should be a bull rider. But if you've ever looked a 1,600-pound bucking bull named Ugly in the eye and thought about holding onto his back with a stiff rawhide handle, some pine tar, and a prayer, well, you'd know why I favored skateboarding. So this isn't the whole first chapter. This is only about 70 words. But look at what we have already. So the genre, it's roughly contemporary. It could be, some decades in the past. The reader age range, it feels like a young adult novel. This feels like a teenager. The setting, we might not know where Salt Lick is precisely, but that certainly sounds like a small town or rural community in the West. Main characters introduced. Goal or problem? Well, there is some hint of it already that his priorities are different from what his family and his community might expect from him. Plus, the whole thing about bull riding being potentially very dangerous. We get the point of view, first person, and it sounds like a teen boy from a rural or Western community. So all that in that first chapter or first paragraph. Haunted the Ghost on the Stairs, I opened with dialogue, which you will sometimes hear you shouldn't do, but I think it works as long as you make it clear who's talking and where they are. So it starts, I don't like it, Tanya said. I glanced down at my sister, then back at the hotel. It looks like an old castle. It looks haunted. I laughed. Don't tell me you're starting to believe that garbage. She hunched her head between her shoulders. Of course not. I only mean it's spooky. You just feel that way because of everything that's happened. So this is a ghost story, and that's pretty obvious from the cover and the title. But in the book itself, John, the narrator, doesn't find out that Tanya has seen a ghost until the end of chapter 2. And then it takes him a little time to believe her. So I wanted to still establish up front that you're going to get a ghost story. And I found this way to work in those words like haunted and spooky to give the reader that promise right up front. It also starts to establish the relationship between the two. John's goal throughout the book is to protect his younger sister because of some losing a different younger sister in the past. And you get some hints that there's other things going on, which, you don't want to keep too many secrets, but giving a hint and then explaining it shortly after is a good way to sort of hook the reader into finding out what's going to happen next. With The Genie's Gift, this is also a fantasy novel. In the first draft, or an earlier draft, I started with Anis and Kasim crept across the grassy courtyard to the kitchen building. They squatted, one on either side of the doorway. Anis glanced over at her friend, tall and lanky in his pale blue robe and white turban. So I was starting to establish the setting and give that Middle Eastern flavor. But in revision, I realized that I didn't have any fantasy elements until chapter 5. And that I felt was far too late. It started to feel like a realistic historical novel. And then the fantasy elements came in suddenly. So in revision, I started with Anis knew the candy must be enchanted. The genie cook always put some kind of protection on the food, so no one could eat it until he said so. Would it stick her jaws together so she couldn't speak? Turn her lips and tongue blue? Taste like camel dung? So we still get some of those words that give the flavor of a Middle Eastern setting, but we also get definitely a fantasy element. And this isn't a huge problem. It's certainly not the problem of the book, which is that her father is trying to arrange a marriage for her. And so she goes on a journey to find a genie to help her get out of that situation. But it is still a little bit of problem to maybe hook the reader on that first page. They turn the page to see what happens. By the end of the first chapter, you know a lot more about the situation. So you can't usually write the perfect first chapter when you start a book because often you may not know what the promise is until you finish the book. So don't worry too much about starting with a great first chapter. Go ahead and move forward and get the rest of your book and figure out your goals and your story and your characters and all of those things. But after you have a draft, you probably want to go back and consider that first chapter very carefully, since that's what's going to hook an agent, an editor, a reader. Think about what promises your first chapter is making. Are those the promises that you want? Does the rest of your story deliver on those promises? And if you find a disconnect where the opening doesn't seem to promise the right things for your story, then figure out which is a better match for your goal. Because if your promises are correct, but the story doesn't fulfill it, you may need to do major revisions on the rest of the story. If it's the opposite and it's your opening that is a problem because it's not making the right promises, then think about how you can revise that to better establish those promises, or perhaps find other places to start. So that's it for today's Write Better Right Now. Next week, I will get back with some more specific examples of openings, and then we'll move into making sure that the middle of the story is just as exciting and dramatic as the beginning. Thanks.